Hello there, chess fans from around the world. Welcome to the final of the Skilling Open. We are going to do a roundup of day one of the finals, day one of two. And what a day of chess, unbelievable. I hope I can do it justice. I'm going to do a recap of the games and the day. And yeah, I hope I remember everything I wanted to talk about, but let's get into it. And we'll start with game one. Magnus had white, Wesley had the black pieces, and Magnus opened with pawn to d4. We have knight f6, c4 e6, knight f3 d5, and we'll probably go quickly through some of the openings. We've seen a lot of this before, a lot of options here. Queen's Gambit declined, or what Wesley did here, the terrace. You can also go for the rook goes in, you can play the Queen's Gambit declined, or this so-called terrace system. Wesley has played this before in the tournament, and he's actually played this before in his career. And it can be a very aggressive line for black, but also very solid. Magnus seems to prepare here a line with e4, where we have a queen trade. So at first it looked like we're not going to get a super exciting game. Knight c5 and bishop e6. Now the choice is white can win the pawn back right now, right here, right now, but at the cost of giving black development and symmetrical position. So most good players here prefer to take the knight, take the bishop pair, and also damage black's structure. So the idea is to eventually leave black with this structure here and win this pawn on e4. If white can do that, usually he's going to have a good endgame. Of course, both players know that, and Wesley has played this line before, so he has some ideas. King e7 now, protecting the pawn. We have castles, knight b to d7, getting the pieces out. White is in no rush to win this pawn. This pawn should fall eventually. Bishop b3, knight c5 now, trying to force white to give up the bishop pair, which he does. Rook f e1, getting ready to win this pawn. And when you win this pawn, there's another weakness behind it. But Wesley's idea is to play g6 here, which he does. We have the trade. Magnus wins the pawn back, and now he has his desired superior pawn structure. But e5 is Wesley's idea. And after f4, bishop g7, try to hold on to this pawn and trade down. Turns out it's not so easy. People are wondering if king d6 works here, and if that works, then maybe that holds the position together. But it looks, the king is slightly out in the open, so it looks a little bit dodgy. So perhaps Wesley didn't want to allow any tricks, but he did instead, after rook f8, he did allow f takes e5. And after rook f5, pawn to e6. Now he does win this pawn back right now. Bishop takes b2. And he has a lot of trumps to simplify. In some cases he can go for the bishop endgame, and he can also trade a rook here. So I think in general he should trade a rook. And after rook d1, I think rook c7 would have been a good way to trade down here. But he decided to defend the 7th rank. We can't allow white to give this check here. g4 now by Magnus, so he has a slight, something to work with. But probably it should be a draw. But let's see. Rook e2, attacking the bishop. Probably it's best to go here, because after this, there's rook here, and now we are on the d file, ready for this penetration. Trying to get counterplay or simplify the queen side with a5. Magnus now finally gets in, at king f6. And here Magnus decides to go for the b pawn. He could take this pawn, but then a4 and black starts to push. It's all about containing the king side. If black can do that, it's going to be a draw. But Magnus is not going to allow him to simplify too easily here on the queen side. a4. And now the geometry of the chessboard starts. The king doesn't have a lot of squares. And Magnus uses that to great effect with a g5 check here. A very nice move, forcing the king to go to one of these 3 squares on the 5th rank. King takes a pawn, and rook takes b5. So now he's hitting the king and the bishop. So it's a fork. King f6 had to be played here, and the game should be in the balance. For instance, king here. We take this, the bishop moves, bishop comes back, and white tries to push the a-pawn. It's going to be a difficult defense, but it might be holdable. What Wesley did is a blunder, but it's not immediately obvious why. Magnus took the bishop. Wesley, of course, took Magnus's bishop back, and now Magnus pushed the pawn e7, which should not be a problem because we can stop the pawn, can we? Wesley did not play this move. The geometry of this is just super fantastic. The winning move. Rook b5, pinning the rook. So now it can't defend. You can't do two things at the same time. It's overloaded. So your choices are take here and kills the queen. Well, you don't really have a good choice. And what's worse, the rook is attacked. So you can't push the pawn or take it, because I take your rook with jack. So big problems. Also you can't play this because I take with jack and then I make a queen and I'm up a rook. So fantastic motif, and this forced Wesley to play something else. B takes a2 and try to hold on, and at first it looks like black might be holding on. Okay, first queen e7 check, king h6, and now rook h4. Seems to be holding after rook h5, but Magnus had seen further, and this maneuver and the geometry of this maneuver is just fantastic. Queen f8, queen g7, you have to interpose. Queen f4 check, the rook is pinned, there's only one move, g5. Again, the geometry, check, only one move, you have to play here. And now finally I come back to f8, and we have the same position, except the pawn on g6 is now on g5, which means that the rook on h5 is only protected by the king. So now rook takes h5 will eliminate the defender of the queen, and Magnus wins. Just unbelievably beautiful stuff. And the maneuver that started here, queen f8, then it went here, and back here. This sort of triangulation of the queen there, absolutely fantastic stuff. So Magnus takes game one with this beautiful finish. So now it was up to Wesley to have the white pieces, and can he strike back? Let's immediately see that. So Magnus with black now, and Wesley with the white pieces. All the way back. e4 now, the first move by Wesley, and e5 by Magnus. We got it, yes, the Italian game yet again. So we're gonna go quickly through this. We've seen so many Italian games in this tournament. Everything stock standard here. a5, knight f1, bishop e6, bishop b5. We've seen this all before. Knight to e7, and d4, bishop back to a7. Didn't we see something similar in against Giri, where Magnus sacrificed a pawn? So if white was to take here, we always have knight g4 hitting f2. But Wesley played knight g3, knight g6 now covering the pawn, which was now maybe under attack. h3 and c6. Bishop has to move, and Magnus goes for a space grab on the queen side. Bishop e3, rook e8. Both sides just getting the pieces out. Queen c2, b5, and now this positional move here, b4 by Wesley. And my guess is that eventually white wants to stabilize and play for c4 here. But Magnus does not allow that. He takes on b3. And this might be a questionable decision by the king. He now gives up the a-file more or less. And after queen c7, Wesley still decides he's going to take the a-file. Queen b7 and rook e to a1. So now he's threatening to triple on the a file, winning material. So Magnus has to do something, and he has to challenge the a file immediately, which he does, and we have the trades. But now Wesley can take on e5, hitting the bishop, which has to take on e3 now. First he interposes the check, and then he takes on e3. But now we can take on f6, and we've actually won a pawn. Bishop goes back, and pawn takes g7. So 6 pawns for white against 5 for black. We're not counting this one, it's going to drop soon. Okay, knight to e5, queen d2, and Magnus takes here, and king takes d7. So white is up the pawn, and even has a slightly better king. And let's see what happened. King g2, avoiding bishop takes h3, b4, and now Wesley moves in. Not the best move according to the computers, but it should be good enough. Knight f4, king h7, and takes. And here Magnus, in a tough position, plays a bad move. He takes on c3, and after this, it's actually, it should be winning for white. It's plus 14 when I turned on the computer here. F takes e6, queen f7. And first he gives this check, and now he plays e5. But Wesley should have played bishop d3 here first. Bishop d3, the idea being to play e5. Black is actually in a whole lot of trouble. If he tries to block, we can play bishop c4. And if queen d1, we can give some checks or take on d6 immediately. So yeah, black might just be lost here. Instead, e5 was played by Wesley, and this allows Magnus to play queen d1, covering the square. And now probably there's not enough for white here, more than a perpetual. And for a while here, we see Wesley give a lot of checks, just trying to figure out what's going on. He gave a lot of checks to win some time and sort of figure out if he wants to play it on. And eventually he decided to take this pawn, play the position on. I mean, he's down after the first game, so he has to try something. After queen d4, we see another bout of these checks, which really don't accomplish much, but other than keeping the game going, while he thinks about, if he wants to try for something. King e7, and eventually he decides to take this pawn and come back. And there shouldn't be any real way for white to lose here. I mean, this is always going to be covered, this pawn here. So most likely at this stage it's a draw. But somehow it's now slightly better for black. Probably not close enough to winning, but at least black can try something now. Bishop d4, pressure here. The queen now starts to give some checks, comes back to g3 to cover. And yeah, c2 can't be played because there's a check here, and eventually I'm going to give some kind of check, picking up the pawn. Bishop comes back to f6, and again we have another bout of a bunch of checks. And seems like at this stage Magnus was trying for a little something. I mean, he's pushing the h-pawn, he's trying to get the king in. But there was a long game, and eventually Magnus backed out of his plan, went back with the king. And they should have agreed to a draw at this point, but now strange things happened. Queen e5 should draw, bishop b5 is fine, probably the best move, because we're hitting the bishop. But somehow Magnus played king f8, and this is just made in a few moves, absolutely forced. Unbelievable blunder by Magnus. And now it's time for Wesley to demonstrate the geometry of the chessboard with these queen maneuvers. Everything's forced. King g5, queen h5, Magnus resigned, because this is going to be a checkmate. A well-known mating pattern here with the queen. Unbelievable stuff. And now we're actually tied 1-1. So on to game number 3. First, let's go back to the starting position. Now let's get the names right. So Magnus with white. Game 3. and Magnus opens with d4. We have the same moves as in game 1, except bishop b4 now by Wesley. The Rogozin queen a4 check by Magnus, and now forcing variation, a3, forcing this trade, castles, bishop g5, h6, I went a bit wrong there, bishop g5, h6, bishop to h4, bishop d7. Okay, the queen has to move. I mean, nobody likes to have the queen here in the line of fire, so the queen goes back. Knight a5, seemingly hitting the pawn, but Magnus plays a very aggressive move here. I mean, this day had everything like geometric motifs, big blunders in game 2, and here we have g4 by Magnus. He's just going for it. g4, g5. He just wants to attack. So black can indeed take the pawn, which he didn't do when he will come under attack after g5. And I guess Wesley did not fancy that, and he went for a g5 himself, which is not a good move according to the computer. And funnily enough, this is not the last time somebody will play g5 in this game, and every time it will be not the best move according to the computer by a lot. So never play g5. Never play g5, okay? Yeah. Okay, so Magnus now plays bishop g3. The knight jumps into e4, and Magnus's idea is clearly to try to open up h4, open up the h file, and just go for the checkmate. But Wesley will not allow it just yet. Knight e4, h4 anyway, and Wesley now takes the bishop, giving Magnus these double pawns. And now he doesn't want to allow h takes g5, so he takes on h4. Rook takes, we have to protect the pawn, the king does, and now g5. Second time g5 is played, and computer didn't like it. It preferred e4 here, giving white pretty decent plus right here. But okay, on with the game. g5, Wesley wants to defend here, rook h8, we have knight into e5, getting more pieces into the attack. G takes h6, and note that we can't take because of knight takes f7 at the end, so king f8. And now Magnus took on c4 and queen g5. So hitting the pawn here, which would win the rook, so we have to defend it. King f2 takes, queen c1, offering the queen trade, and well, Wesley doesn't want to straighten out the pawns for white, who would have a good ending. Plays king e7 instead, and we have a trade. Bishop d2, preparing to double and eyeing the pawn, so rook a to b8, protecting it. And now a high class move, rook h5, just taking away squares from the 5th rank and eyeing maybe some rook c5 move in some positions. King g6, first we have to protect the pawn, so rook a to h1, and now because of this threat probably black is forced to play f5 here, but now g4 by Magnus. Again, Wesley doesn't want to open up the 5th rank. Also, if f takes g4, bishop e4 is also a move, so he prefers to keep things closed here. But now Magnus can play g5, but yet again the computer didn't like it and thought it was definitely not the best move, but it looks good. I mean, you have these pawns here, and you have a defended pass pawn. And now if you can defend it with a king, your rooks can roam around, and that's exactly what happened. Bishop f3, takes, king f4, and after rook d5, now the king has protected the pawn. This rook is free, and free it would roam. It's coming over here, c5, rook e3, hitting this pawn, and black is he's just out of moves. You need to protect this. You can't do it with the king because I go here and the pawns are just rolling. You can't do anything. Wesley tried this, but he takes c5, rook a6, and rook d1. The rook is coming into the game. The pawns are strong. Nothing black can do here. Nothing to be done. And yeah, Magnus takes the lead again. I mean, what's going on here? Unbelievable stuff. 3 games and 3 wins. So this sets the stage for the final game. And yeah, long story short, Wesley needs to win it. If not, Magnus takes day 1. So Wesley So with white, Magnus Carlsen with black, the final game of day 1. And Wesley opens with e4 again. And now c5 by Magnus. He's not going to go for the Italian, he's going to go for the World Championship preparation from his match against Fabiano Caruana. Knight f3, knight c6, and if we have the open Sicilian, most likely a Sveshnikov. We have an open Sicilian and knight f6, and Magnus plays the Sveshnikov. No real surprise here. After d6, Wesley goes for the same line that Caruana did most of the time in the World Championship match. He played this move, knight d5. Magnus took, and in the World Championship match he did vary a bit here. He played both knight b8 and knight e7. In this game he went for knight b8. And here a surprise by Wesley. Surprise for some. I was surprised how many people were surprised by it, because all the way back in, there was a book series by New in Chess called Secrets of Opening Surprises, or SOS. And I think in the first book there was a variation, an article written by Guijarro Bosch, a Dutch IM, where he advocated this tricky line with queen f3 and queen a3. And that's what happened here, queen f3. And there are some tricky ideas. Sometimes you can play queen c3 and knight c7 is very annoying. And after a6, as played by Magnus, then queen a3 is actually also very annoying. There's big pressure on d6, and you have to be careful here. Bishop e7 is a good move. b6 should be okay, which is what Magnus did here. And now bishop g5. The bishop into thin air. If you take it, I will give a check on c7 and take your rook. So Magnus plays bishop e7. Maybe f6 should be played. Bishop will go back to d2, and then white should be doing pretty good. But Magnus played bishop e7. Wesley took, and now the king is in the center of the board. The center is a bit closed, so maybe it should be okay. But let's see. Castles, bishop e7, knight back to c3. Now with the rook being protected, the knight was actually threatened. Knight d7. And now with the king in the center, you want to open it up, so Wesley plays f4, queen c7, and now it takes on e5. Can't take with the pawn, so we take with the knight. Queen b4. Queen feels out of place here, so he wants to improve it now. h5, the bishop comes out, and Magnus tries to run back with the king to f8. Wesley goes to the open file here, half open f file. Rook e8, rook f5, hitting the pawn. And Magnus prefers h4 here over g6. Trying to hold on to the pawn here, but rook f4 insisting. Queen d8, protecting the pawn. First king b1, always play king b1 in Sicilian. Rook h6, and now Wesley So points the gun the wrong way. Alekhine gun. Usually we see Alekhine gun with the queen behind and the two rooks in front. On a file, not a rank. So he's using Alekhine gun on a rank, on the 4th rank. Amazing stuff. He's just ganging up on this pawn. Wesley played h3. Sorry, Magnus. But now the pawn is a bit weak here. Bishop c8, trying to add some protection to the pawn. a4, king g8, rook d2, e4. Still looks better for white, but still looks like everything is off of grabs here. Rook h4 wants to soften up the king's cover a little bit, and also the pawn here. a5. We finally have the trait, and bishop f5. Here maybe Wesley could have played g4 with a simple idea just to take the pawn. But he played rook h5. Queen c8 by Magnus. And this does give up the b6 pawn, and this might be where things start to go wrong for Magnus. Queen takes b6 and knight g4. But have they gone wrong? Because now Magnus has some evil ideas. First of all, if you just take this knight, it's going to be bishop g4. Where does the rook go? It doesn't have a lot of squares. Let's say we go here. There's going to be a check here. King here. I'm gonna chase the rook. I'm gonna chase the rook. I'm gonna give it jack. A long variation, but at the end of it, bishop f3. We pick up the pawn, and this pawn simply queens. Long variation, but looks very, very dangerous. Also, there is the big threat of rook takes e2. When knight takes e2 allows queen takes c2. So Magnus did have some ideas, definitely, after knight g4. But there's a big flaw, and Wesley found it. He played bishop a6, hitting the queen. Now where does the queen go? If it goes here, bishop e5. First he played rook e1, which makes sense to get the rook out of the skewer here, which would happen on b5. King here, and now queen e8. But let's have a look what happens if queen d7. And this would have happened if he had played queen d7 first. Bishop e5, then he would have played rook e1 like in the game. But there's a big problem. Big problem, guys. Now if you go back, I'm going to take your bishop. I'm up a bishop. If you take it, it's going to be a big check on the back rank. You have to go here, and now a big bishop move to d3, winning the queen. Again, fantastic geometry of the chessboard on display here. So Magnus played instead queen e8, but now of course you just lose the bishop for nothing. But Magnus was hoping for some counterplay, which unfortunately just did not exist, and actually he did not bother here and resigned. White has many good moves. Rook f2 is a solid one, just protecting this, and white is just up a piece for nothing. So just an unbelievable day of chess. No draws, a lot of great moves, great motifs, back and forth. And 2-2 on game one, on day one. So it's all to play for tomorrow. Nice setup for the storylines. It's Magnus's 30th birthday. Wesley is the last one to kind of beat him in a big match in the Chess960 World Championship. So anything can happen, and yeah, I'm tuning in tomorrow. I hope to see you guys there. How about a thumbs up for the old man? Show some support. Really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.